Welcome to the Northeast Kingdom Voice. I'm your host, Scott Wheeler. Today's guests are Tim DeLaBruere and Dana LaPlante. They are here to talk about a variety of issues facing the Abenaki. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Scott.
Thanks for having me.
You know, there's been a variety of stories in the news in recent months, even recent years, about the Abenaki. Some people will say the Abenaki of Vermont, and then they will say, well, the Abenaki of Vermont and the Abenaki of Quebec are disagreeing. So you're both very familiar with the Abenaki people. How do you weigh in on these topics?
You want to go ahead, Dana?
Sure, Tim. It's a cultural, shock to at least me. I mean, Tim we're related. To have, four groups of people in the state claim that they're Abenaki, and they're really not. They have the idea that they are. There, a lot can be said about practices and stuff that they have copied from our ancestors over the years. But like Tim was saying, has said many times, that there is, no Canadian Abenaki or no Vermont Abenaki. We're all, one Abenaki. So to have four fake groups claim that they're Abenaki is just wrong. Tim, you want to take over?
Sure. One other thing I'd like people to understand, that when you hear the discourse here that there's Vermont Abenaki and Canadian Abenaki, that irritates me, because that's colonialism. There was no Vermont borders. There was no Canadian border. That all came later. The historically known Abenaki people were all over what we call New England and Canada. It is the Abenaki tribe, and to divide it and to create this atmosphere of them versus us, that just shows that Vermont has a lot to learn. And I think as you see things that are slowly happening at the University of Vermont and in Burlington, you're seeing people are starting to catch on that who gets to determine who is an Abenaki person, when NEK was completely left out of this recognition process. And Scott, we discussed things in Minnesota at a symposium, and a lot of the people throughout the whole country were saying Canada provinces don't recognize Indigenous people. This is just an American thing that's been happening. The historically known people need to be part of that process, and when they're left out, you get I guess chaos. And that's kind of what Vermont's dealing with now, is you're finger pointing. Everybody's trying to say who's more Indigenous than the others, but we need to really start acknowledging the truth is that you've got a historically known Abenaki population and then a self-identified Abenaki population.
And to make it clear, you, both of you, who I've recorded your ancestors' story quite a bit, the Obomsawins, you come from a historic family that there's no questions whether the Obomsawins were Abenaki.
Right. And in lies, there are Abenaki people living in New England and in New York. That's just part of what people do. They immigrate and move around. But that's where I like to say historically known. If people can tie their ancestors back 500-600 years through genealogy, that's different than somebody who's claiming that they're Indigenous because they've got a seventh generation person that may or may not be Indian, but they can't prove it either way. I mean, historically known people go right back to the Jesuit records, and everything's done legitimately. But this recognition process that the state of Vermont created didn't need that. They wanted to let the tribes recognize themselves without showing genealogy or proof, and that's a problem.
Yeah. The one part, I've laid claim to being part of the problem myself as a writer, as a history person. I got a lot right, but I got some things wrong. And I try to rectify them, like this whole theory that, I think most people understand now that it isn't true. Hiding in plain sight is, people are saying, well, they didn't know. Some people are fond of saying the Abenaki living in Vermont, nobody knew because they were hiding. And well, I got that wrong. They weren't hiding. I think some people just melted in just because, but I've seen many photos now from the 1800s that there were Abenaki living here or coming down. A lot of them came down from Odanak to sell their wares. They were living public lives. I'm not certain. You might be able to tell me, but I think, is your grandfather the last of a generation now that has a direct link to Odanak? Because your grandfather, I think, owns land on the reservation, doesn't he?
Yeah, I don't think that it's the last of the generation. His mother and I think Dana's grandmother maybe all came. There was a big group of sisters that came at the same time.
Right.
Yeah, they were born.
Is your grandfather is like, I know his cousin was Paul Lehar, who just died in recent weeks, and then there was Mrs. Gertrude Essoff. But is he the last of that generation of cousins?
Now you put me on the spot. I know that he was the baby of the group. He was the youngest of that generation, so it's possible. And it's that group of family was quite large. I think there was Robert was the last name,
and Dana. Now, what's your ancestry? Like you're also related to Tim through the Obomsawin family, aren't you?
Yeah, my grandfather's mother was born on the reservation. Yeah, so like Tim was saying, that whole group immigrated down here. I want to say maybe in the 50s, Tim. Don't have an exact date, but I believe your grandfather is kind of the last of that generation. My grandfather's sisters, one lived in the Carolinas and she was over 100 and she passed away some years back. So I'm sure that he's one of the last ones of that generation. So
not to correct your family history, but just from talking to from interviewing Gertrude and Paul, you were down here before the 50s. It was,
yeah.
I want to think that maybe even before the 20s, because Gertrude talks about being in Newport during the Great Depression and just how bad you had it. Is like Gertrude, who went on, as you know, to be one of the founders of the East Side Restaurant. She said part of her story came, part of her desire to make sure she fed the people who went to the East Side plenty of food was because of the fact of how poor she was. And so Tim and Dana, this is just a question. I think by now most people understand that there's many people who have questionable links to Native ancestry. And some people might say, well, just let them do their thing. They're not hurting anything. It's more like a hobby for them, kind of like, people getting together and reenacting the Civil War. Now, what do you think about those people who just say, let them do their thing?
I think it's actually atrocious. If you think about it, it's a form of ethnocide. It's replacing people and erasing another group of people. You see what's being presented in the local museums as indigenous people on WCAX playing with their snow snakes every winter. Like things that are being presented are just it's not fair. I mean, at some point, it's not cosplaying as indigenous people. There's real consequences to this. And look at what happened in Burlington. There was $50,000 for an art statue that was taken that could have been done in a more respectful way. So people are losing out by getting a non-legitimate form of like a presentation of Abenaki culture or history. So it is a little more serious than people pretending that they're in the Civil War running around in battlefields. It's a bit offensive. I think people in Vermont are starting to catch on. You see it in the colleges. You see it every article. Scott, you said to Todd that you're going to get bombarded with people. I think people just want to hear the truth. And if you look at the comments are overwhelmingly starting to shift towards they want the truth.
Yeah, I've had Jacques Watso and Danielle Nolette, and from the reservation on, and I got emails. Todd had a letter, not a letter, had a phone call. One person went as far as to say, "But you write Vermont history. Why did you give the Canadian Abenakis a voice?" And so just having you on there will be people just mad about it. And I don't really care. They've offered to boycott me. They've tried to get Todd to take me off the air. They want to boycott the Northland Journal. Well, you know what? The journal's I'm going to be retiring pretty soon, so that's okay. But I won't be disappearing.
Let's see, Scott, do you get that intimidation or bullying from like historically known Abenaki people? Do you get that? Happened to me when I was on the commission. They wrote nasty letters about me. Were making things up about me having lunch with the governor and just the weirdest stuff. But they bully people into submission, and then they claim that they were the victims. And that is like a broken record that has been happening ever since I've been following this, since the commission. They go after people's employment. They go after they go after the media if they don't get enough attention. I think this is why Odanak stepping up is fantastic, because Odanak is doing the work, but they're not bullying anybody. Right. They're coming down and just presenting a very simple challenge. Prove to us who you are. And that should be very simple. Right. But it's always, we have the documents. We have this. We don't want to show you that we're Indian because we'll get bullied. But they're on TV looking for attention, and they're applying for grants looking for money. Odanak's not being malicious. They just want proof. And if they're related, they're related. That's kind of the point. It's like, prove it. Don't just say it.
Yeah, so, and like you've over the years when I did things wrong, you never bullied me. You just said, "Hey, Scott, and you educated me and other people." That's how come I now have seen the light. And actually, I use Odanak in my. I find that they're very easy to work with. It's like even on simple things is. I called up once because I wanted to clarify something. Is a lot of people, especially tourism related people, like to repeat the story that Lake Memphremagog, that Memphremagog means beautiful waters. Well, that was actually never meant to be the meaning of it. That was the name of a book. And then over a period of time, people started repeating the story that, it means Abenaki. It means beautiful waters in the Abenaki language. And then slowly that people started disagreeing with it. So I wanted to find out the exact word and were as close as I could. So I called up the reservation or reserve, whichever one you want to call it, and they clarified it that it basically means large expanse of water, something like that. And the reason that hasn't really caught on is beautiful water sounds more romantic, which is fine, but don't say it. That's Abenaki language.
Yeah. That's the biggest problem with kind of what you were hinting at before, letting people pretend and go around and say things that they heard from their grandparents. I'm a historian. You know that I went to college, St.
Yes.
Lawrence University, studied Native history. I think stories from your family, all of these oral traditions are very important, but you can't base history off from them. My best friend at St. Lawrence was from Ireland, and her grandfather used to tell her and the kids, don't wander off into the woods because there's Indians there. We know there aren't in Ireland, but that's what her family said. Your grandparents or great grandparents could have said anything for any reason, but it doesn't mean it's true. Right. And that's where you get these misnomers of names, or, who knows why somebody would say that, their mother or their great grandmother was an Abenaki princess, but it happens so often. And then that becomes, I'm not going to say a delusion, but it becomes an actual identity for people today. Just like it's become an identity for Lake Memphremagog. It's misinformed, it's wrong, but unfortunately that's what we deal with.
Right. I feel kind of, for the ones who truly are, I'm not saying, because I don't know enough to know if any of them have Abenaki, so I'm not going to, but right. I often wonder what it does to children who grow up thinking they're somebody, then later find out they are not.
That's one of the things we talked about at the symposium. You're ripping somebody's identity out from underneath them. Like, that is what they believe. Right. And you see all of these words that people use, fake and pretending. I don't really agree with that. I think these people genuinely believe, what's been told to them. And how do you just turn around and tell somebody, like everything that they built their persona or their person against, that's wrong? They're never going to agree with you. And it's hard. It's a very difficult thing to do. And that's what Odanak is fighting right now, is trying to figure out how to compete that.
Yes. Yeah, I've actually had to go to the school system, and a couple of the other tribes have gotten federal grants to present Native teachings, and I've had to contact the school to say that, my children they won't be involved in that, because, they're going to learn from our own ancestors, So, I haven't supported, anything that they've tried to, put in the system. And it's very common among, like Tim was saying, we do it among even our own family, right? You say, who are you related to? And it's not to, put you on the spot. It's to, in Abenaki culture, they look at 4 generations back, right, Tim?
Yeah.
Is generally is where you're related, and 99% of these people, they can't do that. Tim and I are federally recognized from Canada for showing our lineage. And they have a very stringent process to which they do it. So it's very, disheartening and concerning to have people claim that they are and they're not.
Yeah. And to put out there is, this isn't an only issue. It isn't the Abenaki aren't the only ones facing this. It's actually a nationwide, and to a degree, a North American thing. It's suddenly, as they say, it's cool to be Indian. And I've traveled quite a bit in the Midwest, and even to the reservations, you pass through them, or like down in New Mexico, the people, the natives are selling their wares, and I've even talked to them about the issues, these issues, and they said it's alive and well wherever, anywhere in this country, Um, we non-natives kind of think it's cool to be Indian now. One thing I heard during my time up at the reservation is that people like to view Native Americans either as the noble man, he's the man of the earth, and almost mythologizes them as these great people, uh, or they're the horrible savage. And within reality, just like the rest of us, we fall somewhere in between. But a lot of people are stuck now on the noble Native American, and they want part of it.
Yeah. It's interesting. I do want to let people know that Vermont is, after my experience with Dr. Kim Tallbear and this symposium, to see 2 days, 9 hours worth of hundreds of prominent indigenous community members, chiefs, elders speaking out about this. Vermont needs to realize it's becoming the ground zero, the biggest example of how this is going to backfire. And all these large reserves that have hundreds of thousands of people are starting to band together to not allow it to happen in their state. So Vermont's becoming this is what we don't want to happen in New Mexico, all over the country. And right. to see Susie, Jacques, Daniel, and Daryl and everybody stand up and just say, hey, look, the state of Vermont decided to do something without taking any of our people's wishes or wants or concerns. The thing that irritated me the most about the Vermont recognition wasn't just that they got recognized. That's the state's prerogative. I disagree with it, but I'm just one person. Why didn't the state choose to include and recognize Odanak? They're historically here. They're part of Vermont's history, but this wasn't right. This is where it's replacing and erasing an indigenous group. There's no way that you can't say that these Obamswin families weren't part of Vermont history. There are letters written from George Washington trying to get the Abenaki people to side with the Americans during the conflicts that are going up. And those people's ancestors are completely tied to people living today. They're not just, oh, I'm an Obamswin because my fifth grandmother or grandfather had an O for a last name or didn't check the box that they were white. They literally have a direct tie, and they have Vermont historical significance, yet the state of Vermont chose to ignore them. And that to me is irritating.
Yeah, it seems kind of interesting coming from Vermont, which likes to at least pretend to be on the leading edge when it comes to even racism and such. When you have to, I've actually started to wonder whether that's just giving lip service because, wouldn't you view that? I think you've even said it. It's just part of colonialism. We claim the land, and now we're claiming their identity.
Yeah, and that's the other scare tactic that you'll see. The self-identified people will say, "Don't listen to Odanak. They only want a land claim." I've never heard of that. That's not the point. They are 1,000% protecting their culture, and what they see happening in Vermont is insulting to them, and they're not going to stop. People think this is just like a flash in the pan. I tell you, the dedication coming out of the Abenaki people from reserve, off reserve, is extraordinary. The wheels are turning, and I think, like you saw in Burlington, I'm getting when I spoke in Minnesota, I had a bunch of people reaching out. I think people are starting to see that Odanak's not going to stop, and the state probably should revisit this and just at least figure something out. And right. I think that's where we need to be.
Right. Okay, Dana. And what say you?
Tim covered it well. I mean, things absolutely have to change. We've been saying it for a long time, and the wheels are turning in that direction. The state needs to recognize the Obamswin family in Vermont and other Abenaki families that are descendants from Odanak. I from getting in the schools to even state positions. They've within departments they're creating a indigenous part of DCF where if a child is taken, there's workers that look to see if they have Abenaki family locally that they can return them to before they do anything else with them. There's federal money, and that's part of the problem. The feds align with state mandates a lot, and I see it here in the correctional system. People that are incarcerated that are on the rolls for Swanton and other places, they cater to them and provide them with any request as far as indigenous religious stuff, items, and these people are not even Abenaki.
Right. Okay. Guess we draw. So tell me, both of you, does this make it harder, for you when you say you're Abenaki? Because I think a lot of people now, a lot of people throughout the years have actually questioned this quietly. So if you tell somebody that you are of Abenaki ancestry, what kind of response do you get?
I was mortified growing up because every time in Boy Scouts or any type of camping environment, anytime I talk about that, or I was ashamed and embarrassed because of what we see in the media and what you're seeing at the powwows when I was younger in Vermont. They were from people from all over the country. Like it was so hard. And then I'd go up to NEK to their powwow. I've only been there 2 or 3 times. I can't remember. But just to see a community that looks like them, each other, they talk like each other, they live together, they are an actual tribe. It was just a little embarrassing growing up. And I always had to have this talk. No, I'm not from Swanton. I'm not from Evansville. I'm from Odanak, and people in Vermont look at me like I'm speaking Chinese. Like, what are you talking about? If you're Abenaki, you're from Swanton. I'm like, no, I'm not. Like they just erased all of the actual historical facts that there are people here, like our families, Jeannie Brink's families. There are people in New York, New Hampshire that have ties. And you talked about Daniel Nolet and all the pictures that he was showing. These are pictures that go back to the late 1800s of the families coming down to their hunting camps, selling baskets. And unfortunately, people grab onto those photos and say, those are my family. This is in my hometown. That's got to be my great grandmother. And Daniel Nolet will tell you, no, we can find 5 people on the reservation that are directly linked to that person today. You can't use their picture. You can't put it in a museum and say this is proof that, self-identified people are real. They need to have their own proof, their own pictures, and their own stories to tell. And that's what's not happening.
I've told you this story. My wife had a distant cousin who really got involved in this, and he created a whole new narrative for the family, which are 100% European, but he implanted old photos. And it was like so interested for the older members of the family who knew some of the people that he transformed into natives. It was like, no, that's not but like a lot of people, my late father-in-law just let it slide, and they all kind of sat back and chuckled, and but so I've seen that happen too. I actually feel, I don't want to dispel any of them. I feel bad for the ones who truly do have Native ancestry in the groups, because I do, whether there are or aren't, but if there are some, I feel for them.
But that's another topic for another discussion. I have the blood, and I would never consider myself Abenaki because I wasn't raised that way. And Susie, every time I say that, I think she wants to smack me, but I don't feel like I had an upbringing there. I have the blood, but I would never go on TV and do a ritual and tell people that I understand what's going on because I don't. But somebody who may or may not have, 6, 7 generations down the line, a partially indigenous person shouldn't be doing rituals and telling stories. And at some point, like what actually makes somebody Abenaki? And I think for me, it's family, it's a connection. I don't need to be raised the same way everybody else on reservation did, but they welcome us and Dana's family because they know who we are. They know our great grandparents, and who are probably first cousins with their there's a family there. And that's what's missing when you just create tribes in the 70s. These people aren't really they haven't lived on a plot of, it just seems strange. What is the definition? And that's of what it means to be an Abenaki tribe. That's why the historically known people should have been included. There should have been some common sense getting the heads together. But the state decided to do everything back to like closed doors and behind the scenes and let people identify themselves.
Tim, it's funny, and Dana already knows this, but you're talking about family, and I'm sitting here thinking, you're related to Dana, Dana's related to you, and Dana's related to my late wife. And yes,
there you go.
So we have a little triad here.
Yeah.
But okay, we've run out of time, but I'd really like you on next week. Are you guys up to that?
Absolutely.
Sure.
All right. Well, so we're gonna wrap up. We're gonna wrap it up, and we will see you next week. Thank you for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
And thank you to the viewers for tuning in to another segment of the Northeast Kingdom Voice.